and welcome to this JINSA webinar. We're here to discuss the situation between the United States and Israel and Iran. We were expecting the ceasefire that was announced by President Trump 2 weeks ago to expire earlier this week. Instead, we've had a continuation of that ceasefire, and so have an expert panel here to discuss what it all means and where we're going and what to expect next, perhaps. I'm joined by Ambassador Eric Edelman, a distinguished scholar at JINSA and former Undersecretary of Defense for Policy, General Frank McKenzie, the Hertog Distinguished Fellow here at JINSA and former Commander of U.S. Central Command, and JINSA Distinguished Fellow General Yaakov Amidror, former Israeli National Security Advisor. Gentlemen, thank you all for being with us. Ambassador Edelman, maybe I can start with you to characterize the current situation. There was a ceasefire to enable negotiations. Negotiations sort of keep not happening. Iran, in the meantime, the United States has put in place a blockade. Iran claims that's a violation of the ceasefire. President Trump has now posted about creating a kill zone in the Persian Gulf. That doesn't sound very ceasefire-y. So what is the current situation? How should we understand where we are at in this conflict?
Well, I think we have, what I would describe as a somewhat unstable ceasefire, in the sense that there's been a pause in kinetic military activity, certainly by the United States and Israel, against Iran. The president, when the ceasefire was announced, indicated that the blockade would continue. The Iranians have seen that as a violation of the ceasefire. Arguably, technically, a blockade is an act of war. And the Iranians have been engaged in attacks on shipping in the Gulf themselves, to which the president's responded with the Truth Social post that I think you just were mentioning, Blaze. The whole point of this pause or ceasefire was to enable negotiations and the work, particularly of the Pakistani mediators, with some help from, I think, the Egyptians and the Turks, to get Iranian and American negotiators together. The president has extended the ceasefire indefinitely, although reports in the press suggest he only is prepared to, have this go on for, 3 to 5 days to see if negotiations are possible. But right now, his proposal that was presented apparently by the Pakistani mediators is met with no response at all from the Iranians, which raises a question of whether they're even capable of responding. And then the president will have a fundamental decision to make, whether he goes back to kinetic military activity in order to try and coerce the Iranians to go back to the table, or whether he just, sort of allows this ceasefire to drag on indefinitely in a kind of no peace, no war kind of scenario. The only thing I would say, and I defer to my friend and colleague and former CENTCOM commander, General Frank McKenzie, the president seems to have shown a real chariness recently about resuming kinetic military activity. If you look at the movement of U.S. assets into the region, both seaborne and air assets, it's clear that General McKenzie's successor, a couple of times removed, is preparing options for the president should he decide to go back to kinetic activity. But the real question is going to be, is the president ready to do that in the face of what he has shown himself to be quite sensitive to, which is reaction by the market and by American public opinion, which remains extremely negative about this war. And in fact, support for the war has declined over the 8 weeks, not grown or even stayed stable. So that's, I think, where we are right now.
Thanks, Ambassador Edelman. And I definitely do want to talk about options, especially on the military side, if the ceasefire were to fail. But first, I wanted to ask you, General McKenzie, if you could give us an operational assessment of the blockade that the United States has imposed. We have tweets from CENTCOM giving us statistics on the number of ships that it has turned back, reaching almost 30, I think, at this point. But there's also reports in the media that maybe an equal number of ships have somehow evaded the blockade. What is your assessment of both how well the blockade is working and what its effects are, and how the United States is going about making sure that ships aren't getting out of the Persian Gulf?
Sure. So the problem of the blockade is one of broad area maritime surveillance. BAMS is what it's known. You get broad area maritime surveillance by integrating imagery from satellites, SIGINT, signals intelligence from other platforms, from manned aircraft, from unmanned aircraft, from AIS, which is a maritime navigation squawk that should be used, but often is used in the breach in the Middle East. But there's a whole variety of sources that CENTCOM gets information from, and they build a very comprehensive picture of what's up there. I think the blockade is generally successful. I can't tell you that one or two ships haven't slipped through, but I suspect far fewer than are advertised have successfully slipped through. And so I would assess the blockade as an operation is largely quite successful. And as you see, they're expanding operations into the Indian Ocean, far to the west, out of area operations. But there are a couple of things just to bear in mind as we look at the blockade. Significant fraction of the U.S. Navy's cruiser destroyer force is now engaged in this operation. Probably at least 20 crew des assets, as we would know, mainly destroyers, probably a couple of cruisers thrown in there with the carrier. LCS ships, amphibious warships are there. A lot of Marines, more Marines joining. So this is a big endeavor, and CENTCOM is fully capable of running this operation. They have the command and control architecture to do it, but a significant number of ships are tied up. The second thing is there's risk here. First of all, the Navy does not like to operate in narrow waters. I don't blame them. Those ships are not meant to operate with their radars over land. They can do it. It's not the preferred method, but your warning times are very short. If you get a major attack from a cruise missile launch from metropolitan Iran, it may be measured in seconds. Now, we've seen the Navy perform very well down in the Red Sea against the Houthis with a threat like this. So I have no doubt that the Navy can defend itself if necessary, but nonetheless, the risk is high. Additionally, if you do VBSSs, which is the shorthand term for visit, board, search, and seizure, there's always the opportunity for somebody on the ship to decide this is the day they want to make a last stand. They're going to attack the boarding force, or they're going to blow the ship up, or do a variety of things, all of which could result in casualties. So there's that risk. And again, Naval Forces Central Command, U.S. Fifth Fleet, the Marines, and CENTCOM are managing this, but it's just a risk that we should recognize. Also, there's the risk of floating mines. The Iranians don't adhere to the standard practice, the law of war practice, which says if you mine, you must record it and know where they are. They're well beyond that, believe me. So it's possible that mines are drifting out there, or that they have deployed mines in order to create a circumstance where a warship might hit a mine. And let's be clear, a warship hitting a mine is very different than a tanker hitting a mine. On a 150,000-ton tanker, if you hit a mine on the bridge, they look at each other and say, gosh, did we just hit a mine? On an 11,000-ton warship, if you hit a mine, everybody knows you hit a mine. In fact, the ship's probably in danger of sinking. So all these things are being accommodated by the people working this problem right now, but the risk is high. And the last thing is, and I'll be interested, we may know more over time. Remember, there are two navies that Iran has. The Iranian Navy, and that Navy is largely destroyed. Larger warships, typically, we've cited the numbers, 150 or more, whatever that number is, largely decimated. The IRGCN, though, Navy, the Islamic Republican Guard Corps Navy, those are all your small boats. A lot of them still left. But more significantly is the IRGCN, we know from past practices, selects and promotes officers based on aggressiveness and ideological purity, not competence or level-headed decision-making. We've seen this play out in several incidents over the last 20 years up in the Arabian Gulf and in the Strait of Hormuz, where ships, U.S. sailors have been taken prisoner, British sailors have been taken prisoner, ships have been attacked, drones have been shot on an RQ-4 in July 2019, for example, without reference to higher command. So there's always the risk now. The Iranian chain of command is already a little rickety. Now you've got the IRGCN operating up there, and their principle is if they're willing, let me rephrase that. They're willing to make very aggressive decisions, confident that Iran will have to back in and follow them, Iran military leadership. So that's sort of this is a high risk operation. The U.S. Navy is doing a magnificent job of it right now, but the risk is very high, and I don't want to minimize that risk.
General, if I could just stick with you for a second, you mentioned both the risk of mines and the risk of the IRGCN, their fast boats and other capabilities. And I think President Trump in that Truth Social post referenced both recently. But we heard yesterday there were reports that at a hearing of the House Armed Services Committee, defense officials said that there might be up to 20 mines that the Iranians have placed in the strait, and it could take up to 6 months to clear them. President Trump today in that post said, we are clearing them. It would take just a couple of days, and also that we're going to go after the small boats and other IRGCN threats. What are our options for demining and trying to deal with IRGC Navy, and how much of a risk do they pose?
Here's the way to think about it. Think about it in terms of four operations that CENTCOM can undertake or is undertaking. The first one I've just described to you, which is the blockade. Here's the second one, the clearance of the Strait of Hormuz. Now, look, you don't have to clear the whole straits. You have to clear a proofed passage, a Q route is the term we would use for it, where ships can pass. You don't have to do the whole thing. Look, I heard the 6-month comment, and I also heard the White House disavow that. I don't know. I think 6 months is a pretty conservative estimate on how long it would take to clear the straits. It might not be 6 days, but it's certainly, I don't think, going to be 6 months to do this. I don't know what we're doing. I just don't have access to information about what we are doing or not doing to clear the Strait of Hormuz. But I can tell you that in order to do that, you're going to send platforms that are vulnerable into an area to sweep mines. So CENTCOM's going to want to be sure that the Iranians are not going to be able to attack our vulnerable mine countermeasures platforms as they do their work. So that means that you've got to go up there, you got to strike those fast attack boats, you've got to strike where you think missiles, short-range missiles can be launched. You're going to go after Iranian observation posts, either visual or electromagnetic. You're going to do all those things. CENTCOM was into that program when the ceasefire occurred. I think they got a good way into that program, but there's probably more work to be done before you're going to be completely confident about your ability to go in and do this closure. So that's an operation that's hanging out there. What I would look for would be, when do you see U.S. ships transit the Strait of Hormuz, U.S. warships transit the Strait of Hormuz? That will be an indicator of where we are in this process. That has not yet occurred. We could be doing work right now. I just don't know the answer to that actually, Blaze, as I look at the situation. Again, some of the precursor work's been done. So there's the clearance of the straits. There are 2 other operations out there. The third one, and the next one I'll talk about, would be if we're directed actually, and I believe we have now been directed to go in and prevent counter seizure activities. So that's going to raise the risk a little bit. You're going to have to get closer up into the straits. And by that, I mean, if small attack craft are either working against what mine laying efforts we have out there, or if we decide to extend that protection to other ships that are going through the Gulf that are challenged by Iran, now you're going to be in direct confrontation with the Iranians. You're going to be in a gun battle up there. We'll prevail in that gun battle, but the risk to the U.S. Navy gets higher as you do each of these steps. So that's sort of the third module that could be employed. And the fourth module, of course, would be resumption of large-scale combat operations against Iran. CENTCOM has plans for that. We can pick those plans back up and get into that program very quickly. That would include strikes on everything across the whole gamut of the Iranian military, and perhaps other targets as well, should the president direct it. So those are the 4 operations that we should, when we think about it, we should think about the ongoing blockade. We should think about the clearance of the strait. We should think about counter seizure operations or directed action against ships that are challenging our mine clearing operation. And the fourth thing would be, ceasefire is over. We're going to go back into a large scale resumption of strikes against Iran. As I think about it, that's the way I sort of divide the 4 military options, Blaze.
Thanks, General McKenzie. Just really quick follow-up on that third set of activities, the counter-seizure activities. Is that principally something that has to be conducted from the water by naval vessels? Is that an aerial task? Is it a combination, joint air and sea?
It's joint. And in fact, sometimes we give the impression that it's only the Navy up there doing this work. This is a joint operation. It's Navy centric because we see the platforms, but land-based air power has a huge role to play here, as does sea-based air power. And of course, the Marines are fully engaged in it as well as boarding parties, potentially raid forces if necessary, but also the significant combat air power that deploys with the Marine Expeditionary Unit. So it really is a joint operation. Army attack helicopters are involved as well, and possibly Army missiles launched from the southern end of the strait, if necessary, fired against targets up there. It is a joint operation, which is why which is why it is a complex operation. But believe me, NAVCENT has the command and control to run this.
And then just given that you mentioned how much of our surface fleet is involved in this blockade and operations around the Middle East, how long do you think we could sustain the blockade as it's currently being deployed?
So nobody's better in the world than the U.S. Navy at doing UNREPs, keeping ships supplied at sea. We do it better than anybody else. I would think that CENTCOM has worked a plan to rotate ships offline. Just because there are 20 ships up there doesn't mean 20 ships are working all the time. You can bring them into ports. You can do a variety of things. And they're going to want to keep that very quiet, of course, so that the ships don't become targets. A ship is much safer while it's operating at sea than when it's alongside in a port somewhere. But they'll rotate that through. We are very good at doing this. We can do this for an extended period of time, in my opinion. The price, though, will be paid in future maintenance, which is something that I knew as a CENTCOM commander. If you maintain large forces in CENTCOM, which are not programmed in the guidance for employment of the force, there's a future bill that's accruing that will eventually need to be paid. I would also add as an observation, the Navy needs to be much more efficient in their approach to management of their maintenance cycle.
Thanks. Let me now pivot, General Amidror, to you and the view from Israel, but in particular, what is Israel seeing Iran doing during this ceasefire? Is it in any way reconstituting any of its military capabilities? How is it using this period?
First of all, it's clear for us that the decision now is in the hands of the Americans, in the American side. We are preparing ourselves for resuming the war. We are not taking part in the blockade. Our Navy was not built for such operations so far from Israel. We can help in intelligence, special forces, and so on and so forth, but not more than that. What we see in Iran today is first, they are trying to get out of the tunnels which had been blocked by us and by the Americans, as many launchers and missiles as possible. Because they understand that the only feedback they can have if will be a decision to resume the kinetic war is the only feedback that they have is to launch more missiles and so on. I don't believe that they have any secret card in their hands. What we will see probably is more of the same. How more, I don't know. It very much depends on our ability. When I say our, it's the Americans and the Israelis, to identify where they are hiding the launchers and the missiles and to destroy as many of them as possible at the beginning of the war, as we did in June. And I think that was, if you ask what was the Israeli main job during the ceasefire, is to identify the movements of the launchers and the missiles, so we will be in a better position to do what is needed if the war will be resumed. The other area in which we see the Iranians working very hard is to rebuild the anti-air systems. Most of them they lost. They cannot go back to the same capabilities that they had before the war. Since June, they lost the majority of them, the vast majority of them, and they will try to build with what they have, something that might threat the American and the Israeli pilots. They were very happy when they succeeded to intercept the F-15. but from what I understand, they didn't succeed to rebuild the system. It's isolated capabilities built around launchers that they succeeded to save from the Israeli operation in June. The Iranians are speaking about something new that they will do. I don't see them having such a surprise in their cards. I think that they will be more focused on the countries around them, the Gulf countries, because it's easier. They don't have the abilities that we have to defend ourselves. And they understand that it is the soft belly of the Israeli-American alliance. Those Arab countries which do not take part in the war itself, but still part of the American axis, and they will try to put pressure on America and us by launching as many rockets and drones and so on to destroy their facilities. I believe that will be the big difference between the previous stage, in which they shared it between Israel and the Gulf countries. Now they will be put more focus on the Gulf countries because they understand that with Israel it's very hard because of the defensive capabilities that we have in Israel. Part of it's in Israeli anti-missiles and the THAAD batteries, which are here and the Aegis on the sea. So this, I think, is the only difference that we will see. And we are preparing ourselves. The Air Force is ready. We have a new list of targets. The decision will be made between the Americans and the Israelis which side of the Iranians now we want to attack and to destroy. And I believe that after 24 hours in which we will get rid of the anti-air systems that they succeeded to bring into the battlefield, as it was during the most of the time of the war, the superiority of the Americans and the Israelis over Iran will be again the most important card that we have in our hands.
General, do you have a sense of how quickly the Iranians are moving, either in terms of digging out the missiles or and the launchers, or on the defensive side, putting back together their air defense system? I guess another way of asking that is, how long does the ceasefire go on before Iran gets back to a more dangerous place?
Yeah, I think they're probably having more success digging missiles out than they are working air defense. A lot of that air defense, you're gonna have to replace it. You're not gonna. Those are complex systems. Radars have got to be tuned. You've got to do a lot of work to get an air defense system working. The good news is we should, and I don't know this, but I'm guessing we have very good oppressive, in fact, ISR overhead, both electronic and visual. So we should have a very good picture of what they're doing. I continue to believe that while the Iranians may have been able to protect missiles by going into deeply bunkered storage sites, it's also an error on their part because it localizes where they are. It allows us to fix our collection. We can see those locations. It makes it very easy to track those systems when they come out. So I'm sure they're trying to do that. I'd say they're probably going to have more success trying to rebuild their missiles, but of course it's not only the missile, it's the tractor erector launcher, and there are a finite number of those, and we have destroyed a number of those. They don't need tells for every weapon system, but for the longer range and the bigger systems, they certainly do. So I would say while they are making progress in digging some of that stuff out, I would say it's given us an opportunity to further refine our own targeting, and should we be directed to do so, we could get after them with a really high level of ferocity.
General Amidror, do you share that assessment or a sense of how quickly the Iranians
Yes,
move?
I agree with General McKenzie. I think that this is the areas in which we are focusing ourselves, and the combination between the Israeli intelligence and the American intelligence can identify many of those launchers which they try to move out of the tunnels after they open the exits that had been blocked by us. The question at the end of the day is kind of a race between their ability to move from one place to another and our ability to intercept on the ground. I don't have an answer. We learned a lot through the war how to do it, as well as the Americans, and it will probably be better in the future, but we have to understand the Iranians are very smart guys, and the Iranian system is learning all the time and changing all the time. And unlike our Western bureaucracies in which it is not so easy to change, they are changing very fast. Something which is not so easy, not in America, and not in Israel, and probably not in America. It's kind of ways who we learn better from the war, and who will be more flexible on the ground to identify the changes and to react.
General Amidror, you think they're capable of that sort of adaptation and disseminating lessons learned and new tactics and procedures, even given the damage that's been done to their leadership and their command control structures? You think they're adapting in real time right now?
No question. Knowing the capabilities of the Iranians commanders, they will learn, they will adapt, and they will change. They are very flexible in their decision. As I said, should be appreciated, the ability of them to learn and to adapt.
Is that something that we might have underestimated in thinking that the decapitation strikes at the beginning of the campaign would cripple their ability to command and control more than it actually did?
It's crippled their capability to command and control. And for example, to organize big salvos of missiles at the same time. But it didn't change the ability of the Iranians to learn and to change.
Ambassador Edelman, let me come back to you and the diplomatic front. It seems like there's been a bit of a two-step going on, particularly with the American delegation, which was going to Pakistan on Monday, then wasn't going to Pakistan, then was going to Pakistan, and then didn't go to Pakistan. And then ultimately, President Trump extended the ceasefire, saying he's waiting for a unified proposal from the Iranians. Is this sort of merely an issue of disagreement between the two sides on a deal? Are there bigger logistical problems in these negotiations? What's going on, and what are your expectations on whether we are actually going to see further rounds of talks either tomorrow or at some future point?
Well, some of the kind of herky-jerky nature of this negotiation is a consequence of the success that the joint force, both the U.S. and Israel, had in the opening days of this war. I mean, eliminating the command and control, and particularly eliminating the supreme leader, I think has complicated Iranian decision making. You get the sense that they have moved from having robust, vigorous debate about policy below the level of the supreme leader, but ultimately decisions being made by the supreme leader, which are then implemented by others, to a bit more tentative kind of collective leadership, where the debate is continuing. I mean, the fact that the president said the blockade was continuing, the fact that he then said that the Iranians were in essence capitulating to every demand he had made, I think didn't sit well with a number of the Iranian leaders. And given the fact that I think it's harder for them to make decisions, I think blocking things is always easier. And so I think you got a situation where it was possible to block a return to negotiations, particularly in light of the pretty high pace of U.S. sustainment that's going on. I mean, the air bridge that we have that's bringing both more munitions and more aircraft and refuelers into the theater, I think could easily have been read by the Iranians as indicating they were going to face a repetition of what they did both in June and more recently in February, where they were negotiating and then the United States launched an attack. So I think that explains, I think, a little bit of why this has become a bit more complicated. Um, what they're not negotiating, something like the JCPOA in 2015, which was, a very lengthy document with a number of annexes that were highly technical. They're actually only negotiating what appears to be some kind of interim memorandum of understanding with some very broad heading points that would then have to be filled out by, future negotiations. And therein, I think, lies the rub, in part because not clear to me that the American negotiators are all that familiar with some of the technicalities, some of the details here. And so there's, potential for misunderstanding, particularly because you're also not dealing with a face-to-face negotiation. Part of this is going through, mediation by the Pakistanis, who have an interest in keeping the parties, at the table. And so the tendency, I think, here is for them to shade a little bit what they're hearing from both sides in order to get the parties to stay at the table. And that can lead, I think, to misunderstandings, miscommunication. And I think we've already seen some of that. I mean, we saw some of that in the first round of talks where the Iranians insisted that Lebanon was part of the ceasefire. The U.S. side said, no, it isn't. And the Pakistani mediator said, yes, it is. So, you have this kind of, misunderstanding when you've got mediation like that going on.
And Ambassador, do we have clarity on what the U.S. negotiating position is? What is the deal that the Trump administration has put on the table? Do we know?
Well, all we have are, fragmentary reports through the press, some of which the administration has denied, and some of which, appear to be better sourced than others. But it does appear that they've asked for a 20-year moratorium, total moratorium on or freeze on any enrichment activity by Iran, as well as some steps on disposition of the 900 pounds of highly enriched uranium at 60%. I mean, that's what we've seen in the press. I mean, what that doesn't tell you is, for instance, what would be the disposition of the more than 9,000 pounds of HEU that's been enriched at the 20% or below level. How will that be disposed of? So, I mean, this is one of the reasons why I'm stressing that the lack of technical expertise among the U.S. negotiators is a little worrisome, at least to me.
General Amidror, President Trump put out in extending the ceasefire that part of the problem was that the Iranian regime is fractured. Do you have a sense of how well decision making is working with the Iranian regime? Is it in fact fracturing? Are we seeing any sort of splits between the different elements, or is it all staying fairly unified?
I don't know, but it's not important. What important is what will be the terms of the agreement, how we reach the agreement, how long, and what people will say in the middle, and how it will be represented by those who want the negotiation, those who do not want the negotiation. At the end of the day, there are one should what will be the Iranian answer, if it will be an answer. If this answer is enough to begin negotiations, and the most important part is what are the results of the negotiations, because we have so many black points in the puzzle that it will be a waste of time to try to understand what someone told someone in Tehran in the middle of the way. I mean, we don't know. The truth is, we don't know. And what important is to see the answer, if it will be an answer, to begin the negotiations, and the most important one, how it will be ended.
Is there, from Israel's perspective, a good deal that would be acceptable?
Yes, I very much I agree with the Ambassador Edelman that the lack of experience and knowledge about all the technical issues in the American side is not a good sign for a good negotiations. One. Second, if it will be for 20 years, it will be like the Obama's agreement. The sunset was the weakest point of the agreement under Obama, and it will be the weakest point of the agreement under Trump. No difference. There is no one is mentioning the 20% enriched uranium, and no one is mentioning the missiles. Two parts, two issues which are very important from our point of view. By the way, under Obama, the missiles hadn't been mentioned, and that would allow the Iranians to go ahead with the program. So I hope that this administration will not make the same mistakes, and I hope that this administration have better negotiators, because those who negotiated under Obama were very bad negotiators.
I want to open it up momentarily to the audience, so if you have any questions for our panelists, please feel free to submit them using the Q&A function in Zoom, and then I'll read them out. But first, I wanted to turn back to you, General McKenzie, and maybe dive a little deeper in that fourth option of that you laid out, which would be a return to kinetic operations. And get a sense of, if you were still commander of CENTCOM and you were presenting the president with options, what would a return to operations to conflict look like? Would it just be a continuation of what we were doing before the ceasefire? Is there anything more that we could do this time around, either to get at more of those Iranian capabilities, those missiles and drones and fast boats, or perhaps to go after counter value targets to gain leverage on the Iranian regime and try to get them to end this conflict?
Yeah, so the Iranians, of course, are not the only learning organization in this conflict. And so we've had an opportunity to examine our strikes to this date. I'm sure CENTCOM's given a lot of reflection to that. I think we'd be ready to go right back against the missiles, your drones, manufacturing areas, bunker areas. And if they're rebuilding air defenses, you get after that very quickly. Any decision against counter-value targets would be something that came from the president. You'd have to issue that guidance if you want to start going after things that would affect the Iranian ability to govern electrical production, bridges, things of that nature. All of that would just have to come from him. CENTCOM has these options. And the point I always make is this is a plan that's been worked for many, many, many years. This is not something that we're doing on the back of an envelope. I owned this plan for 3 years. My successor, General Kurilla, owned it for 3 years. Admiral Cooper owned it. Now he's executing it. And before me, CENTCOM commanders worked it. It's been refined. We continue to look at it. Now we've had several weeks of engagement with Iran directly to update our targets, to look at how they're doing. And again, I'll reemphasize the point I made. Even though we're not striking them, we're looking at them real hard. So we know what they're doing. And through both visual, electronic, and other measures, we have a good picture, I'm sure, of what the Iranians are doing to reposition. We could go very quickly back into this should we be directed to do it.
Are you concerned at all, General, about our stockpile of munitions, either offensive weapons or defensive interceptors, and our ability to sustain another round of fighting?
I think we have the capability to sustain another round of fighting. Commanders are always concerned about stuff like that. What the United States has, though, is a very good system for leveling this around the world. And the guy that makes that decision is the Secretary of War. He's the authority, and working for him, the Joint Staff decides how we rebalance these loads against the contingencies, the potential contingencies that confront us, not only in CENTCOM, but in other areas across the world. So look, it is, I think, a matter of a little concern in the short term. In the long term, though, we've got to rebuild the defense industrial base. We've got to actually create conditions where people are willing to build these weapon systems for us, these projectiles for us, and not be afraid that the next year is going to be cut off for some other reason. If you want to really solve this problem in the long term, you need to take steps toward that. And that's really, of course, beyond the scope of our discussion this afternoon.
If I may add one remark about this specific question that you asked. Look, as the general said, these plans have been done for years. We took into account that the ability of the Iranians to launch missiles into Israel, and I'm speaking just about the interception capability of Israel, were much more than what was done actually by the Iranians. why it is much less, good question. Success of the Americans and us to identify and to destroy and to limit and to make the life of those who are launching the missiles very, very hard. So all the plans that we did took into account much bigger number of interceptions, which will be interceptors will be needed to intercept the big number of the missiles which supposed to be launched into Israel. They didn't reach this number. It is, I think, all in all, it is between 10 to 20% of what we took into account when we make the plan. So the fact that we are not under any pressure regarding interceptors is because what we had in mind is a much bigger number of missiles being launched by the Iranians into Israel.
Well, on that point, let me read out a question that we got from John Hanna, JINSA's Randy and Charles Wax Senior Fellow. And maybe General Amidror, you can start, and then General McKenzie, I'd be curious for your take as well. John asks, is it fair to draw a preliminary conclusion that Israeli and U.S. intelligence probably underestimated the size of Iran's missile and drone arsenals? So not the size of the barrages and that would be fired towards Israel necessarily, but just the arsenal and what it would take to degrade it.
I think that we had the numbers. We succeeded to destroy a third of them. Third had been blocked inside the tunnels, and they used only third of what they had. And as far as I know, we were very close to the real number of launchers and missiles that they had.
General McKenzie, do you have a take on that?
I'm not prepared to agree with that assertion. It's a very reasonable question. I'd like to wait a little while on that. I do think we may have underestimated drones a little bit. I think they're much harder. If I were going to give ground in anything, I might say they had more drones than we thought. But drones are such an explosive new thing in warfare that we're still dealing with it. I think our responses have been very good, but I think I would tend to give more weight to that side of the argument than the missiles.
Maybe sticking with that point, let me push a little further, General McKenzie, and asks, do you think we underestimated the Iranian response towards our Gulf Arab partners, or that we were underprepared to protect those partners and their assets?
I think we were as prepared as we could be given the limited resources that we have. I don't think we could have done a lot more than we have done. There's a finite number of resources that you have. I do think that ultimately the Iranian decision to attack the Gulf allies, and particularly to go after civilian targets, to go after counter-value targets, is going to prove to be a strategic disaster for them. In fact, I would put it on the scale of Hitler's decision to declare war on the United States in December after Pearl Harbor. As you may recall, after Pearl Harbor, President Roosevelt had no trouble marshaling the American people against the Japanese threat. But there was broad division still in the United States, not widely remembered today, about going to war against Germany. Well, Hitler declared war on the United States, took the problem out of Roosevelt's hands. In many ways, the Iranian decision to strike our partners in the Gulf, made it a lot easier for them to cooperate with us, to go from icy neutrality to something far more helpful. And I don't think that process is over yet. So I think whatever small-term gain the Iranians achieved, and I understand why they did it to increase pressure on the United States from our Gulf allies to just please make it stop. Well, it hadn't been quite that clear-cut. And ultimately, it will work to their detriment strategically in the long term, in my opinion.
Blaise,
if I may add to I agree that it was maybe one of the most important decisions of the Iranians, but I think that it's too early to judge the result of it. It very much depends on how the Gulf countries understand the lessons after the war. If the lesson of the Gulf countries after the war will be, yes, that Israel and America are strong, determined, we can trust them, and we cannot trust the Iranians, and the Iranians showed us that they are a real enemy. that is one Middle East. If the conclusion in the Gulf will be that the Americans and the Israelis, yes, they speak very high, but at the end of the day, they are back down and are not concluding the job, and we will remain here with Iran anyhow. The Americans are going back to far away to Washington. The Israelis are going to hold Israel defense very well, but these two guys cannot be trusted. It will be another Middle East, and the result will be the Gulf countries will decide to compromise with the Iranians because the Iranians are more determined, because the Iranians are here, they're not going anywhere, and we should find a way to live with the Iranians and not to trust the Americans and the Israelis. So I think, yes, it was a very important decision of the Iranians, but the result should, we don't understand yet the consequences. Still, it will be clear what is the lesson of the Gulf countries from the war.
Thank you, General Amidror. Yeah, Ambassador, please go ahead.
Yeah, I just wanted to try and put some of this discussion of the estimates of Iranian missile capability pre-war and now into a bit of context. First of all, because most of their missiles are mobile, going after them is extremely difficult. And it was something that in the first Gulf War back in the 90s, we didn't do very well, as some of the major studies after that war demonstrated. And bomb damage assessment is always, in my experience, I mean, I defer to the two generals on the platform here, but it's an art, not a science. Most pilots come back and say, yeah, I hit the target, but that doesn't really tell you whether the target was destroyed or the target was damaged or, et cetera. That takes time and analysis by the intelligence community. We have gotten a lot better at it since the 1990s. And really what's been accomplished is amazing. But people should not be surprised if post-war assessments say we didn't do quite as well as we thought we did, because that's just the nature of the beast.
General McKenzie, maybe I can come back to you really quickly on the point you raised about sort of the momentous decision Iran made to attack civilian infrastructure in our Gulf Arab partners. We've heard that, in fact, that has spurred some of them, particularly the Emirates, to offer to get involved in offensive operations. Is that something that the United States should consider to augment our military power? Do they have anything to offer in this fight?
Well, as you know, both UAE, Kingdom of Saudi Arabia, Qatar, Bahrain, all the Gulf states have very effective fighter aircraft, and so I would say this is not something we're just thinking of right now, and I'll leave it there. They have a role to play here. We talk about that. I talked about it when I was the CENTCOM commander. Should we have a situation where we had to defend the Arabian Peninsula? We're just not coming to considerations of how to employ them today. Again, the result of a lot of thinking over a number of years. So depending on their appetite for it, yes, there are things they can do. And we would certainly be happy to incorporate them into those things, I'm sure.
Great. Ambassador, a question for you on the diplomatic side from Charles Wax. How can we trust any agreement that the Iranians make, considering their long history of lying and cheating?
Very good question. And, the answer, I think, has to be if there's an agreement. And I agree with General Amidror's comments about the deficiencies of the JCPOA, which we've discussed, at JINSA ad nauseum, I'm afraid, for years. But if there is an agreement, it cannot just be an agreement that the United States reaches with Iran. It's got to be backed up by very intrusive inspections by the IAEA, unimpeded by any kinds of cat and mouse games that the Iranians might want to play. And there would need to be, in my view anyway, some understanding that were that to be the case, were they to, play cheat and retreat as they have in the past, that there would be pretty condign and immediate consequences militarily.
Sticking with you, Ambassador, another question from John Hanna. Can you give an idea of what a realistic deal on Iranian missiles would look like, especially taking into account the fact that the main threat to our Gulf partners is short-range ballistic missiles and drones?
Yeah, I think that will be actually one of the hardest things to get to. And one of the things I worry about is that might not be addressed in this MOU that is being discussed right now. That in my view, that's likely to be left for, a longer range negotiation, and that I think could end up, you know, creating the situation that General Amidror just described in terms of fears in the Gulf about being left to deal with this problem, on their own. So I don't have a good answer for how you would get after that problem in an agreement. Again, you'd have to have some kind of ability to verify that, whether it's by national technical means or by inspections. I can't imagine that the Iranians would agree to inspections of their missile facilities. So it would probably have to be some kind of agreement where they, allowed us at least from overhead to see what they're up to. But that will be very, very hard to do, I think.
Are there any existing arms control agreements that would be, you think, a sufficient basis or a good model to build on?
Well, the model would be the Intermediate Nuclear Forces Agreement between the United States and the Soviet Union during the Cold War, which President Trump wisely, in my view, withdrew from in 2019 because it was only two countries in the world whose intermediate range missiles were being limited, us and the Russians, and we were the only ones abiding by the treaty. So the withdrawal from the treaty made all the sense in the world. But if you recall, the verification mechanism for that treaty was something that I think, would have to try and replicate. I can't believe the Iranians would agree to it, which is we had a presence at the portal of the missile production facility in Votkinsk, and we scanned with very sophisticated equipment every vehicle that came in and out of that facility to make sure that they were not carrying missiles that were banned or regulated under the treaty. And I think you'd need something akin to that to really be able to verify any kind of agreement on short range or medium range missiles.
All right. Well, to close out the hour here, I wanted to ask all three of you to give your predictions. Always a dangerous game, I know, but how long you expect the ceasefire to last, and whether it will end with a deal, a return to war, or something else. General Amidror, I'll start with you.
I don't know. What I can say that better from the Israeli point of view, it's better to have no deal than a bad deal.
All right, General McKenzie.
I think I can't improve on that comment. I would just add that if we decide to go back to combat operations, I think the joint force is ready to go and could do whatever the president requires the joint force to do.
Right. And Ambassador Edelman, you'll have the last word.
Well, on the ceasefire, I think, I think it's likely that we may have like about 2 weeks of ceasefire. I mean, I wouldn't expect it to go much longer than that. As to whether it, yields an agreement or not, I completely associate myself with General Amidror's comment. Better not to have a deal than to have a bad one. And I don't think we can exclude that we may end up in a kind of no man's land of, neither peace nor war, with the president carrying this, forward for some period of time. I think in the hope that the blockade itself will bring the Iranians, back to the table to, make a deal he finds acceptable.
All right. Well, Ambassador, General McKenzie, General Amidror, thank you so much for your time and insights this afternoon. Thank you to everyone who tuned in, and please stay tuned in to JINSA.org for all of the latest analyses and updates. Thank you very much, and have a good day.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Ambassador, General, good to see y'all. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Right.